Well, we're talking about attitudes, and now we're going to be looking at some of the patterns that develop when we're looking at our relationships, things that happen at home, in the workplace. And one of the most important things that we just spoke about in communications is listening. And I think it's really important that we understand why we should listen, because I think a lot of people want to talk more than they want to listen, and if they listened they may be able to pick up better. Well, not maybe, would be. So how would you advise when we're communicating with people that we listen, and why it's so important to listen, and how it, I suppose, attitudes, how does listening help with our attitude?
Yeah. Well, if our attitude is that we know everything, then we're not going to listen. If our attitude is this person has nothing to say, then we're not going to listen. My experience has been that whenever I think that someone has nothing to teach me, that's when that person has something to teach me. That's kind of one of the life lessons I think that I have learned. Life has a funny way of teaching us these lessons, and they will repeat themselves over and over again until we recognize what the lesson is. Simply because we keep falling back into the same old traps that we set for ourselves without realizing that we're setting them for ourselves. And it's often to do with an attitudinal stance. That person has nothing to give me, therefore, you know, they're not as well off as I am, or they're lighter skinned than me, or they're darker skinned than me, or they're only someone in a domestic position. But that doesn't mean to say that that person doesn't have a certain knowledge that I may not have and that I may well need. One of the most important attitudinal stances that I know of is one of humility. To stand back and learn from the other person. If I'm talking, if I'm communicating with someone, then I need to be able to sit and listen, to hear the other person's perspective. Particularly, for example, if at work or at home or at school, something, or just amongst a social gathering, within a social gathering, some disagreement starts to happen, and I'm fixed in my belief about a particular thing, and I don't listen to what the other person is saying. I don't have the opportunity to hear a different perspective, because I get locked into my own subjective stance, and can't be objective enough to stand back and say, wow, how am I responding? How am I reacting here? When people don't communicate properly, they don't respond, they react. So, for example, I'm saying something to you, and as I'm talking to you, all you're doing is thinking about, how am I going to respond? How am I going to respond? What's the argument I'm going to give? So that it's just oppositional, rather than, okay, there's a problem here. Am I going to be part of the problem, or am I going to be part of that solving?
Yeah, but Angus, that requires rational thinking.
Well, yes,
But when we are having a conversation, perhaps most of the time when attitudes are called into question is that when you're having a great relationship with someone, or you disagree with what the person's saying. So you're not thinking, well, am I thinking rationally here? What you're thinking is, oh, shut up, because I want to get my point across.
Yes, but the issue is that I don't know how to put this. Simple manners says that I need to be able to listen to what the other person is saying to me. What is their argument? But what happens is that we tend to look at an argument at the end of the argument, when it's out of control and overly heated, rather than at the beginning, and saying, okay, fine, we becoming antagonistic here. Why is that? What's happening? It takes introspection. Confucius.
Okay.
To achieve and maintain an adequate measure of the good life, people must have some insight into their limitations. Yeah, and that says a lot, because most of us don't stop to think, what are our limitations? We tend to think, oh, I know this already. And once I assume that, then I close the door to learning new perspectives. I close the door to learning new things that people are trying on a daily basis to tell me. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
All right. So what about, let me give you a scenario here. Why is it that when we are in relationships, a lot of the time we tend to be flippant with the person who loves us the most? Instead of saying, you know what, let's try and discuss this properly, we actually, in our attitude, in the words that we use, our body language, sometimes we show them the biggest disrespect, but we love them, but we just dismiss what they say, or we just,
yeah. Well,
but we wouldn't go to work and treat our bosses like that.
I often ask people, what drew you together to begin with? And they will give me an answer, whatever that answer happens to be. But then, all of a sudden, it's kind of, once you're in a relationship, you don't want that person that you met, that person that attracted you. You want that person changed into something else, something that suits you better. But you forget that that person is an independent human being, and that relationships are all about two independent people living together interdependently. And until people can actually wrap their heads around that concept, then there are always going to be problems in relationships, because it's always about control. I have to be in control of the situation. In whatever way I'm in control of the situation. Sometimes it's by being aggressive. Sometimes it's about being passive-aggressive. Rather than communicating and talking about the problems and working towards a solution, you dig a hole and make the problem ever bigger, and then resentments develop, and feelings that are less than snowy white come into play. So yes.
All right. I'm going to ask you another question, because I know that many people out there, they know exactly what you're talking about, because as you're talking, they're thinking back to certain occasions and situations where they wanted to get a point across and they just couldn't. So what do? They either lash out, whether it's verbally or physically, they lash out, or they withdraw, and all these things very kind of, you're just waiting for a disaster to happen there, right?
One is aggressive, the other one is passive. Okay, there's passive aggression as well, but
yeah. But let me just finish my point here. What I was trying to say is, people are listening and recognizing what you're saying. How would you give an example, perhaps, of how two people who perhaps, like right now, watching us, they know what you're talking about. They're in that situation where they have a discussion. There's always one person, most of the time in relationship there is, who's always leading the conversation, who will not let the other person speak. Or if the other person speaks, they dismiss it, or they roll their eyes. They do all kinds of things that show you, well, you know, you can talk till kingdom come. I'm really not interested. What advice would you give to a couple in that kind of situation?
Communication, assertive communication. It's about, I need you to stop for a second and hear what I'm saying, and listen to me, because I have a point that I think you need to hear. My perspective in this given situation is probably just as valid as yours. We both see things differently, but how can we come to some sort of compromise that says, okay, fine, you think this and I think this. How can we come together?
How do you get to that stage, though, Angus?
But
how do you get to that stage when you have a situation where you're always arguing about the certain, you know, and you're always, you don't let me talk. So one person just says, well, you know, can you just stop now? I want to have my say.
But you see, but that's all about where you start to set your boundaries along this line that says, little communication problems, huge communication problems. In other words, you're now talking about when you're over here, rather than doing the sensible thing, which is start at the beginning.
Well, you know what? That's really easy to say when we're sitting down nice and calm, but you know what comes to mind here is, can a leopard change its spot?
Yes,
Don't answer that now. We're going to go to a break. But let me just remind you, if you would like to have a session with Angus, then you just say where he is located. He's going to tell you in a minute, and why you think you need to speak with him. All right, this is Dolor Factor Live. We'll be right back.